Okay, we're here today with Eric Frame, who is an independent candidate for state senate in District 6, right there around Sacramento. And then we're also here with, we're back with Bridget Duffy, actually, a California Assembly District 22 candidate. And we're going to touch on a topic that that they are interested in is human trafficking. And they both have stories and perspectives. So, Eric, how about we start with you and tell us what's going on with human trafficking there in Sacramento?
Okay, thanks, Mike. So I was introduced to, I started going to city councils a lot when I first started becoming an activist. And one thing I heard through the grapevine, and then I saw when I did some research online, was that the FBI actually called Sacramento a hub of human trafficking. And I had no idea about that. And Sacramento is my hometown and everything. So that, perked my ears up. And frankly, it's perking the ears up of a lot of people that I'm talking to right now when I'm door knocking and talking at events. A lot of people don't know that we've been called a hub of child trafficking and human trafficking. And I dug a little deeper, and I found that the city itself is not putting nearly enough resources into the investigation of human trafficking. For instance, the current DA, the district attorney, at her final budget hearing, she dedicated less than $100,000 to the investigation of human trafficking. Less than $100,000 on one hand, and the other hand is that the FBI called us a hub of human trafficking. So there's something fishy there because that's not nearly enough funds. When I've spoken to police officers about the issue, they are not giving me much hope as well. And what I hear from them is, well, we think the reason for all the human trafficking is because Sacramento is sort of a gateway city. It's a city in between the Bay and in between Las Vegas, and their human trafficking is much worse than ours here in Sacramento. And they say, we think that's the reason. And then they say, well, I asked them, why were we called the hub of child trafficking by the FBI? And they say something like, well, I think that was after there was a sting, and we got 20 buyers. After that sting, all these stats made us look like we were the worst, trafficking city. So you kind of get these excuses coming from the police force, and frankly, in my opinion, one child trafficked is too many, one human trafficked is too many. So I'm tired of these little excuses. Oh, we're not as bad as Las Vegas. We're not as bad as San Francisco. It's not good enough for me. Let me just finish off on, well, we're in the top 18 worst cities for human trafficking. And one thing I often see is I see people coming into city council and making testimonies about human trafficking. There was a lady the other day that came in and she spoke about a children's receiving home downtown that has been connected. It's right next door to, a prostitution area, right next door to this children's receiving home. So there's something fishy going on with the children's receiving home as well. That testimony was ignored by the city council. In fact, they said, well, that's not our jurisdiction, that's county jurisdiction. But again, you can't, I don't care if it's a jurisdiction excuse, these excuses are getting too old for me, and we need to do something about these child traffickings and human traffickings going on in Sacramento.
I agree. And Bridget, can you go ahead and tell us your story about how you got to, child trafficking is an issue for you I'm sorry, not child trafficking, but human trafficking, because of a story that's happening in your county.
That's right. I started, too much like Eric, going into city council meetings, and I found much of my information there. Well, recently I just discovered that the current sheriff of San Mateo County was caught in a FBI sting operation. He was caught inside an illegal operation, trafficking operation, where underage, non-English speaking, terrified 15-year-old girls were also found. So this isn't a prostitution. This isn't a household prostitution. This isn't a brothel. This is a human trafficking operation. They had trailers in the back. Anyway, he was caught with the sheriff at the time, and not arrested, but detained and handcuffed. And why the Las Vegas police and the FBI actually let them go, I don't know, but probably because they were sheriffs from San Mateo County. And he is up for re-election right now. And I had no idea of this past, and most of the constituents in the district, I'm sure, have no idea. He was appointed actually as sheriff after the fact by one of our current supervisors. So to me, I feel like, you know, the sexual subjugation of children is what we're talking about. And it's, you know, it's a huge problem even when you don't have a name for it. But when we do have a name for it, and it's sex trafficking, and we do know that there are predators that, you know, scan around looking for young boys and girls to, you know, get caught up in this. This could be corrected. Like, there's a lot of things that can't be corrected, but this is why I'm so excited, but, you know, really trying to raise the alarm about this, is because this is something that we can do something about. He's up for re-election. Simply do not elect him again, which could happen if there was a decent amount of word of mouth even alone. But the fact that the media has dropped the ball on this, I have called Channel 7 News. They did a story on this recently, within the last month, and it was canned at the last minute within 2 days of being aired. And I called this station and I talked to an investigator, and I said, why on earth wouldn't you air this story right before an election? And he said, oh, it's old news, you know. And so there's a cahooting going on with the media, with the DA's office, with the sheriff's department, with the supervisors. And it's this overlapping systems of fraternity that sort of, it's the old school good old boys club. And, you know, it's got to be exposed at least. And so we can do that. We might not be able to wrench them out of their seats and throw them in jail where they belong, but we can expose them. And so that's what I think we should do.
Yes, excellent. And Eric, do you agree that there's a lack of media coverage for such an important issue? And do you see that down there in Sacramento?
Definitely. And yeah, it's definitely nationwide. And we've seen this, you know, collaboration, cohorting between media and government entities and public servants before, what should be public servants. So we've seen that. And frankly, I think my theory is that the homeless issue is made worse as well, for many reasons, but for one reason, as a distraction to prevent people from talking about this other issue, the child and human trafficking. I want to solve both issues, obviously, but I believe that's one reason why our current representation actually makes the homeless issue worse and worse, and we're seeing that with an ever-growing population as well.
And Eric, do you see homeless more susceptible to human trafficking?
Yes, and in fact, this morning, I was down by the river, and a veteran named Michael, he was telling me about his daughter that was taken. I wasn't sure if that was through the CPS portion of the trafficking or if that was another illegal trafficking situation, but I've spoken to multiple homeless folk that have had their children removed from them in one form or the other. So yeah, very much. And also, when you talk about the foster care and how there's this whole family court, CPS corruption, foster care corruption going on, a lot of the adults that are homeless right now are actually formerly people that went through the foster system. Yeah. And as we all know, there's a lot of stats out there that people that go through foster care are more likely to be sexually abused, more likely to be trafficked themselves, and more likely to struggle with addiction and end up out there on the streets. And that's what we're seeing. So everything's kind of interconnected, you know, and well, that's why we have good people running for office right now, trying to expose things, and good media outlets like yourself that are actually willing to let people that are speaking the truth come on board and expose what's being done.
We're trying to get it out there, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, Bridget, I read that the Las Vegas Review-Journal had reported after that arrest, 25 women faced deportation after the arrest.
Oh, no.
The two sheriffs that were involved were not arrested at all, had no repercussions. Do you think there's unequal justice happening there in our system?
Oh, obviously. I mean, if it isn't as obvious as the nose on our face, the oldest profession in the world is still considered an illegal profession, right? Illegitimate profession. Women practicing this profession, even though there's questionable whether they're participating in it voluntarily or not, but as an adult, if you are participating in it willingly, why are you a criminal? And then your customer is actually a sheriff, right? This man became sheriff after being arrested in a brothel as a customer. Why? I mean, to me, it seems very, very clear that if anybody is keeping this this system of paying people that are vulnerable for sex, the perpetrators of the act obviously are the persons with the money, not the persons in the vulnerable state wanting to receive money. Why aren't these people in jail? This is why. It's because it's a man's world. I mean, I don't like to get it like that, but because most of the customers are indeed male, and most of the actual, prostitutes are mostly female, it is obviously a male-female divide. Women are going to jail, women's lives are being ruined, men are just getting promotions and going on with their career, and nothing bad happens to them. It's outrageous. It reminded me of something I can't think of right now, but I was going to mention something that happened. Go on.
Yeah, so both of you touched on something that it's the vulnerable that are victimized.
Yeah.
Here in California, we have a lot of immigration, and they're brought over for various reasons. Sometimes sex trafficking, of course. Sometimes they're coming themselves to find a better life, either because of violence in their other country or bad economics. But they are vulnerable. The homeless are also vulnerable. So, can you? I don't know, Eric. Maybe you could talk about the homeless. You did talk about the homeless issue there, but my point is that it seems like the powerful don't have to pay for their wrongdoings. Like I said, the 25 women were subject to deportation, while the sheriffs were not arrested at all. The 25 women were actually not arrested either because they were seen as victims. How can we find equal justice? I mean, what are some solutions to that, to protect the vulnerable? Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I keep falling back on the same thing, which is we really just need to get people in there that are willing to protect the vulnerable. You know, I support the opponent of, the current DA, Schubert. I'm not fully, I'm not in full support yet of Noah Phillips, but I'm in support in terms of the comparison right now. What we do keep seeing is, you know, people in power just getting off with these crimes. And one of the perfect examples in Sacramento was former Mayor Kevin Johnson, who was literally caught red-handed with underage prostitutes in a hotel, and he got off scot-free, and he's retired now. And the worst thing that happened to him was a brave soul, a citizen of Sacramento, threw a pie at his face. And I mean, that's the smallest amount of justice we get right now these days. But we got to keep exposing this. And I want Bridget to be aware also of this. I don't know if you already are, but the CPS corruption, the family court corruption. These are two. This is what we call legal trafficking. It's called legal trafficking because it's trafficking through the state. And CP. Have you heard of this, Bridget?
No.
No. Well, yeah. Well, here's more bad news, unfortunately. But yeah. There's this big corruption going on in family court and CPS. You know, Child Protective Services. And Child Protective Services has monetary incentives to move children as much as possible. So they get, you know, $4,000 to $10,000 per child they move. That's their monetary incentive for funding from the federal government. So what we keep seeing is children moved from foster. That's why you see so many children move from foster care to a different foster care to another foster care. And oftentimes we find in family court that the worst situation, the worst parent, the parent that might be abusive, ends up with the children and with the custody. And part of that is because those worst people, they end up, as we're seeing with our political, you know, leaders, they end up with, you know, protection, and they get the benefit of the doubt, and they end up with more money from, you know, corporations and whoever. But it's a very backwards family court system. There's people pushing for a jury to be brought into family court because right now it's strictly judges. And when you have just one person making these decisions, we're finding that we're seeing a lot of corruption, of course, and poor decisions. So I am in favor of a jury trial, a right to a jury to be brought into family court, and more exposure of CPS corruption as well. I'm blanking on the name of a former senator from Georgia who spent her life exposing CPS corruption, and she passed away, or she was murdered actually. But I'm gonna try and find her name, and I'll get back to you about her. But it's another big issue, the legal trafficking.
That's horrifying.
Yeah, and let's go on, Mike, to, you know, the next topic, but I want to get that one out there.
Sure. That's interesting, Eric, and I think it's something all of us should look into.
It reminds me of a story that happened a couple of years ago. I met a man who had been pulled over for a taillight. He had children in the car. He was arrested. The children were put into foster care. I met him when I was waiting at a court date for something else, and he told me this sad story, and I wound up going to his court date with him for his child. And I was absolutely overwhelmed and appalled that they literally were taking his 3 children from him for a tail light being out, and you know, like a 0.06 amount of alcohol, something like that. But it seemed like they were on purpose taking his children away. And now it gives me chills listening to your story, Eric.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of black markets come from the prohibition of things, the prohibition of prostitution, the prohibition of drugs, the prohibition of immigration. Do you want to go ahead and talk about that, Bridget? What's your opinion on should prostitution be legalized and regulated, immigration and drugs, and how that should be handled, and could that help solve the problem with human trafficking?
Definitely. I mean, the immigrant issue is this is horrifying because basically vulnerability is being created right now by our federal government in that regard. And as far as prostitution goes, to me, a victimless crime from the beginning. The sexual mores that prevent it from being a legitimate business come from, 400 years ago, from the Puritans, who had a cult-like restriction on any sexuality whatsoever. So these are the leftovers we're dealing with in our society. But unfortunately, what we're looking at is a privatized social services, privatized social services. So where we used to have social services that would serve the public, now we have people in charge of these social services that want to make a profit. So suddenly you have being a prisoner creates a profit for somebody. Being sick, actually, in California creates profit for somebody. Being a child, a vulnerable child, now is something that somebody somewhere is profiting from. So to me, the answer is to, yes, legalize and legitimize prostitution for sure, just so that there's a legitimate sexual outlet for people who obviously need one. And if they can't find one, they are going to pick a vulnerable victim to get whatever they need to get from them. But keeping it legal is what is keeping people vulnerable, children vulnerable, and homeless people vulnerable, immigrants vulnerable. If we could change the whole world, of course, we'd have Governor Josh Jones, and he would he would straighten everything out. We'd have all these good people in office, and we'd be serving the public instead of making a buck off the public. It would straighten out a lot of stuff if we weren't making money on people's woes.
Absolutely. And Eric, do you think that, I know that in Sacramento, the homeless problem is really difficult, and it seems like it's illegal itself to be homeless. And do you think that that also makes them vulnerable to the human trafficking?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It is basically illegal to be homeless. All the supposed solutions from our current representation is to further criminalize the homeless, and it's clearly not the right move for humane moral reasons as well as just common sense. The population of homelessness is increasing, and we're actually criminalizing, by criminalizing the whole homeless population, we're actually criminalizing families, elderly folk that can't pay for rent anymore because they're skyrocketing rents and they're stuck on SSI that's not going up either. So we're literally criminalizing our elders in Sacramento. I wanted to touch on the idea of legalizing prostitution, and some of these recent laws, there are recent laws that took away like these sites like Backpage and other sites like that. And I've actually spoken to sex workers in Sacramento area, and those laws have made them much more vulnerable to attack, to any form of crime, because when you had that Backpage website there, people were able to verify who was coming in for the exchange of services. But right now everyone's in the dark, and sex workers are in this more desperate and also more dangerous situation where they're in the dark right now. So I don't agree with those laws either, to take away things that are actually helping provide a safer business. I do want to touch on one more thing, and that there was a law passed in California fairly recently, maybe a year ago, where they officially decriminalized underage prostitution. But I also spoke to some police officers, and they say this has made things worse, at least specifically in Sacramento. And they say that this is because in the old days, they would bring in a victim of child trafficking, a victim of an underage prostitute. They would bring them into jail. They would be able to keep them there safely for 3 days or so. and at least they'd be out from, you know, whatever was going on outside, and they would have safety for 3 days. But with this new law, I'm talking to police officers, and they're saying it's making it worse because instead of having that 3 days to keep people safe, keep these victims safe, they are actually, because they're not criminalized at all, they can be pushed out, and they are immediately, you know, dropped off at a halfway house, which God knows what's going on in these halfway houses, or they're dropped off back where they live with their parents, and then they end up going right back out the door, out the backyard, you know, and off to be victimized once again. So there's all these pros and cons of, you know, specific measures and ideas, but really the bottom line is we need proper representation, and maybe we'll see what solutions can actually be done when we have real representatives in office. So
yes.
yeah.
So, I have to sign off in about 4 minutes. I want to leave you guys with a couple of statistics. A third of all human trafficked people are from Latin America, and 27% of sex trafficked people who are trafficked for sex are minors.
Wow.
So and this is in California. This isn't nationwide. I'm talking in California. California is one of the top states for human trafficking, and like you said, Eric, Sacramento is one of the top cities in California for human trafficking. So I'll tell you what. Can you both of you maybe give me a minute on your campaigns and where maybe you can get some help and maybe a website or something like that? Go ahead, and Eric, you start.
Okay. You can find more info at ericframeforsenate.org. You can also contribute there. We are a strictly publicly funded only campaign, so we do need as much funding from the public as possible. We have been doing a great job door knocking. We're door knocking on a daily basis. I am preaching homelessness as the #1 issue, which it is the #1 issue polling in my district, and I'm getting a lot of support out there. We have TV ads coming. We have yard signs up all over the place. And we're having a lot of success talking to people just on the streets and in their homes, door knocking. So we're pretty excited. And we're confident we can make top 2 here coming up in June. We're excited for the results. We kind of wish May would just fly by, but it's a lot of work here in May. And I'm enjoying it nonetheless. And when it comes to child trafficking, it's an issue I bring up a lot when I'm speaking to people out there on the streets, because I think it's one that can really open their eyes to what's going on. And it's very shocking to most. And when they hear we've been called a hub, they're surprised, and maybe they'll take a bit more action and vote for the right people if they're seeing this issue popping up. So thanks again, Mike, for having me on. ericframeforsenate.org. You can find more, and you can contact me if you want. Eric Frame for Senate. Think big picture.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And then Bridget, I think you're one of 3 candidates in your assembly district, so there's a good chance you could make top 2. You want to talk about your campaign?
I hope to make top 2. I think I could actually even win. When you look at the mathematics, I'm sandwiched between a Republican, a Democrat, and I'm a Green. So who knows what'll happen. I hope that we see real change. This June, there's another election in November, and I would love to see, I mean, I don't have too much I don't have a website or anything. I'm not quite prepared. I heard Cecil Richards from Planned Parenthood said yesterday, don't wait for somebody to ask you. Don't wait for instructions. And for goodness sake, don't wait till you're ready. So I've taken that to heart. And, you know, I would love to, even if we don't make a real splash in June, to see a real coalition between the people who are like Eric and myself, and there's lots of us, to form a real coalition and to really get some of these like key left-right coalition sort of alliances going, where who isn't going to be against child trafficking? This is something that we should all be concerned about. Who isn't concerned about the homeless issue? We should all be concerned about it. So yeah, good luck to us all. And I'm writing a newsletter. I'm gonna try to get it out there on email or something. But we can't let things keep going in the same direction that they're going.
Right.
We might get where we're heading.
Okay, guys. Well, thanks a lot for attending this forum, and I'll get it out there, and maybe I'll see you guys again soon.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, Mike.
Bye. It was nice to meet you, Eric. I hope
Nice to meet you too. I hope you win.
Thank you. You too.